But what if you can't make these kind of changes? Maybe you can't spend more of your daytime outdoors and there's nothing you can do about your interior lighting because you're elderly and in a care home, or you're seriously ill and in hospital. Hospital patients tend to have just those flattened and disrupted circadian rhythms that I just talked about. And some of that is because their light exposure is so unusual. So hospitals often have small windows, you may not be near the window, but also lights are often switched on 24/7. Certain drugs also seem to interfere with circadian rhythms, including morphine, which obviously a lot of hospital patients will be on. And there's some pretty compelling evidence from animal studies, at least, that this circadian disruption matters to recovery from injury and illness. So pity the little mice. There's a researcher in Canada called Tammy Martino who has been simulating heart attacks, I think in mice, basically simulating a heart attack in mice that are either have regular circadian rhythms because they're kept in conditions where they have 12 hours of light and then 12 hours of darkness, like how mice would live in natural settings. But then they simulate these heart attacks in another group of mice who have the rodent equivalent of jet lag, really. Their circadian rhythms are all over the place because their light exposure is so erratic. Now, if you do these experiments, if you give these mice these heart attacks, what you see is the ones with disrupted circadian rhythms are less likely to survive. And you can actually see this difference in the amount of scar tissue that's laid down in their hearts as the hearts are recovering. You see a different numbers of immune cells infiltrating into that heart tissue and helping it to recover. Does the same apply in humans? Should we be trying to improve human circadian rhythms to help them recover from illness and injury? I don't think we know that for sure, but certainly there's a few small studies that have suggested that patients who've had, say, coronary bypass operations, they recover faster, they're sent home sooner if they are, I want to say housed, I'm not sure housed is the right word, but if their hospital rooms have access to a big window rather than them being in a dark hospital ward. So I think we could, there's potential for rethinking the way we light our hospitals. And actually this hospital, Rigshospitalet, this hospital group in Copenhagen in Denmark have been doing just that. So I went to visit Glostrup Hospital, where they have this stroke rehabilitation ward. And they've been doing this study looking at introducing circadian lighting to see how that affects these stroke patients' recovery. Now, circadian lighting is also kind of, some lighting companies refer to it as human-centric lighting. What it basically means is this photo on the right is what the lighting looks like in the daytime. You have very bright kind of bluish white LED lighting fixtures, and they're trying to simulate daylight, so it's kind of brighter than you'd usually get in a hospital ward. This photo was, I think, taken in January. So up in Nordic countries, they have an even greater problem getting daylight into hospital rooms, especially in the winter. So in the daytime, you have this very bright blue rich lighting. And then during the evenings, it gets dimmed down to this kind of warm amber light. They tune out the blue and they make it dimmer and dimmer. And then overnight, most patients are housed in darkness. But if a nurse or doctor has to come in to take readings, do any monitoring, or if there's an emergency, the emergency lights are also this amber colour. So you have less disruption to their circadian rhythms and sleep. And this is still a pilot study, but what they found is that the stroke patients who are housed in these rooms with circadian lighting. They have more robust circadian rhythms, which you'd expect because they have this big difference between the light exposure in the day and at night. Stroke people in the immediate aftermath of a stroke are at high risk of depression and fatigue, but these patients kept in the circadian lighting rooms seem to fare better. And in fact, they're often given antidepressants, and the effect of changing their lighting and strengthening their circadian rhythms is comparable to giving them antidepressants. And then, a subset of these stroke patients also have dementia. And a nurse who cares for these patients in the ward who I interviewed told me that, with these dementia patients, they just seem to have a better idea about what time of day it is, and they seem calmer. And, I think that's interesting as well. So dementia patients. So circadian lighting is also being piloted in care homes, looking after people with dementia. And, as we age and get older and older, the lens in our eye becomes more cloudy. So it makes it harder for light to get into those light sensitive cells at the back of the eye. And you tend to see this flattening of circadian rhythms. And that's interesting because you also see this in dementia patients, but with dementia patients, you often see these things, you get this phenomena called sundowning, where people become more irritable and agitated as the afternoon and evening progress. You also see a lot of sleep disruption and night waking, so people waking up multiple times in the night, wandering around. That puts them at increased risk of falls. It's actually a reason why people often get put into care homes in the first place, because they're wandering around at night and they're not safe anymore. And interestingly, so sundowning, night waking, both of these things are associated with flattened and disrupted circadian rhythms. They're also worse during the winter and on cloudy days, where you get less of this kind of this synchronizing effect of sunlight. So anyway, there have been a few trials now looking at whether boosting the light exposure of care home residents has any impact on their dementia symptoms. It can't cure dementia for sure, but it does seem to result in a slower rate of cognitive deterioration, fewer symptoms of depression, and less deterioration in everyday tasks. So people are more able to get on with everyday stuff like getting dressed, maybe preparing some food for themselves. And if you combine this bright exposure to daytime light with melatonin supplements, and again, if you remember from my own experiment, taking melatonin as this hormone that you release at night, it helps prepare the body for sleep and for what happens in the nighttime. And it's another kind of signal from the circadian clock of what time it is that it's nighttime. So if you combine the bright light in the daytime with melatonin supplements, again kind of reinforcing this message that it's nighttime, you see improved sleep in these patients. There's a growing interest in the link between disrupted circadian rhythms and mood disorders like depression and bipolar disorder as well. And I think Danny may talk about this afterwards, because I know he's very interested in this. So when I was researching my book, I visited this hospital in Milan, where they've pioneered the use of this thing they call triple chronotherapy. And what this is they're combining light therapy, so exposing these patients with really severe bipolar depression. They're exposing them to bright light first thing in the morning, just like the way you treat patients with seasonal affective disorder. So they get exposed to bright light first thing in the morning to advance their circadian rhythms, make them more lark-like, and also increase the amplitude of those circadian rhythms. They're also depriving them of sleep, which may sound completely mad for patients with depression, and they're treating them with lithium. And what these three things seem to do is they seem to jumpstart these sluggish, flattened circadian rhythms that you seem to see in these patients. So both patients with bipolar depression and general depression seem to have, again, these like flat circadian rhythms, this circadian disruption. We're not sure why, but giving them this light therapy, depriving them of sleep, giving them lithium, all these things seem to restart these circadian rhythms and they start to feel better. I think the lithium thing's really interesting. So lithium's been given to patients with bipolar disorder for a long time and no one's really understood how it works. But it looks as though actually lithium is affecting the working of the circadian clock, those molecular clocks in our cells. So it seems to be boosting the expression of this protein called PER2, which is a kind of fundamental cog in the wheel of the circadian clock in these cells, which I think is fascinating. And there's also some evidence actually that SSRI antidepressants are impacting the workings of circadian clocks in our brain cells as well. So studies of chronotherapy for mood disorders are ongoing. I think there's one happening in London at the moment. And I think interest in circadian rhythms is only likely to grow in the coming years, especially with the Nobel Prize having recently been awarded to the scientists who actually unpicked the working of these circadian clocks in our cells.